Today is about us collectively learning and listening, right? Learning and listening to understand and share our own wisdom, right? So appreciate that. And I quickly want to ask our panelists, right? Starting with Tracy, who is hailing from Denver, right? I should say Colorado, shouldn't say Denver. Not everybody lives in Denver, right? To give us a quick, right, description about yourself, and then we'll go with Kelly and then Jeff. Go ahead, Tracy.
Good morning, Doctor, and thank you. And good morning here in Colorado, and recognizing the land that I am on here with the Apache Nation and with the Cheyenne Nation, so our true first forefathers here and sisters. So I'm Tracy Kazee. I am one of the co-founders of the Center for Policing Equity. My background is in policing, 25 years with Denver PD, 4 with NYPD, and also as the director of the National Initiative under the Obama administration. So I'm looking forward to the conversation as always, and it's a pleasure to see some familiar faces, and it's good to be here. So thank you, Raj. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Kelly?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kelly McCarthy. I'm coming to you from Mendota Heights, Minnesota, where I am the police chief, and I'm also appointed to the Minnesota Peace Officers and Standards Training Board. And I was appointed to that in 2019, and I'm very, very excited to learn.
Thank you, Kelly. Jeff?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jeff Potts. I'm coming to you from New Brighton, Minnesota, which is where the office of the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association is located. I am now the executive director here at the Chiefs Association, but I came from the city of Bloomington, where I worked for about 29 years, the last 12 years as the police chief in Bloomington. And I've been with the Chiefs Association now since February 1st. So it's a pleasure to see all you guys. I look forward to the conversation here today. And Raj, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So quick question, right? So since the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, prior to that, the killing of many others, Jamar Clark, right, and others in our community, there have been a popular chant here, right? Reading your bios let me know that you are all accomplished. All 3 of you have listed your time with the FBI, right? I don't know what that is about, but I appreciate, right, knowing that you all have been in Quantico, right, or whatever that place is, right? Seeing all those accomplishments, how would you respond to this question, right? In the streets, in the chant, they say that there are no good cops in a racist system. And then some chant is like, all cops are bastards, right? ACAB. How would you, what is your response? I mean, what are your thoughts? And, how do you feel this in your body and in your emotions? And how would you respond to this? We'll start with Kelly, we'll go to Jeff, and then we'll come to Tracy. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you. Yeah, and great question. I think initially I had the human response of defensiveness because it's just, so often we over ascribe with our profession as who we are. And so immediately it was defensiveness. And then you have to reflect on it and you have to think, okay, why is
going
this?
back in the living room?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So, why is this happening? Why is this a chant? Why do people feel this way? And then when you get over that defensiveness, I think you can really learn a lot. But you have to be willing to dive into it. And the no good cops in a racist system was one that I really had to think about for a long time. And obviously I disagree with it. And yeah, the systems are, but if we're going to go that far, I'd say, well, anybody who pays taxes is now complicit in a system. Like how far out do you go? And so, yeah, it really caused me to think about the system and then my role in it.
Appreciate Jeff.
I guess I agree with a lot of what Kelly said. I think initially that was a little hard to kind of hear, whether it was the ACAB or FTC or whatever however it was put was hard, I think, for people in law enforcement to hear and process. But I think as you kind of really sit back and think about it, what it really is, at least to me and a lot of the chiefs that I talk to, is an indicator of a broken relationship. And, you know, whether or not we agree that the whole system is flawed, I think we can all agree that the relationship with far too many communities and their police departments is fractured. And that should kind of, I think, be hitting home with police chiefs in a way that they need to lean into that and try to figure it out. You can't just ignore it. You can't just be mad about that or defensive about it forever. At some point, we have to figure out, how do we lean into this and figure out how to repair that broken relationship. Now, there are concepts and roadmaps that are out there, but you first have to get your agency and your community to agree to come to the table and try to fix it and work on it. Yelling and screaming, you know, honestly, I think it's one way to get attention, but it's not a way to solve the problem. And I think we're at a point now where a lot of law enforcement agencies, not only in Minnesota, but across the country, frankly, are trying to figure out how to fix those broken relationships.
Thank you, Jeff. Tracy?
So what a really interesting question, because I certainly come at this from two different lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So as a Black woman, I wasn't surprised. I didn't take it personally. I clearly get it, understood it. There's a part of me that always will question, you know, your own, I think Kelly mentioned this, your own complicity in it, right? So if you think about 30 years worth of service, this is something that I've had to reflect on, to understand what part of systems that are broken and not providing the outcomes of safety, what part of that do you play? And this is not uncommon for Black police officers. There's what we call the double bind, and that is this sort of pulling of understanding and relating to a community that at times rejects you, and then also having to navigate this other space where people also reject you, really wanting to be able to provide safety and to be that bridge in a way. So it wasn't surprising at all. And I think what to Jeff's point, in regards to whether or not law enforcement gets it, they still don't get it. This is a very hard thing. If you don't decenter yourself from it, you won't get it. And it makes it very difficult to have conversations. And it also, because if you still center yourself in this, then you're expecting a community or communities that are most vulnerable to have to shape shift to make you comfortable. And that's just not going to happen. You know, there are generational differences in communities. I think you saw that in Minnesota as well. But when you're talking about collectivity as a whole, law enforcement was really pretty much still expecting to come out on top of this, and really expecting to have and continue to wield certain amounts of power. And so for the first time, I believe in my career, I am seeing departments, unions, folks that are struggling, because historically you've been able to say something and it usually either stops it or shifts it back the other way. And that's not wrong. And that is one of the reasons why you're seeing a high number of chiefs retire, because they were not trained to do this. They were not trained to figure out how to navigate and figure out how do you provide a different type of service. The other part of this too is you have to be willing to want to do something different, because even now, even after the election, and you know, I think it was, I can't remember the referendum that you all had in regards to figuring out a different way to deliver service, but would actually remove MPD out of the charter. A lot of folks weren't expecting that. And there was a lot of folks holding their breath on Tuesday. So if we're being realistic about, you know, chants and calls, there's always going to be a space for a demonstration. That's in our history. It's what we do. It's what we support. You know, I think there's always going to be a space for that piece. And then to Jeff's point, I think there has to be a conversation around what does that safety look like? And that means that you have to center communities around that. We have historically been telling communities what we believe they need to be safe, and they are very vocally saying, you don't get it. And no, that's not what we mean. We've also invested in spaces that have not done anything any different. And we have to be realistic about that. And we're often talking about shifting, police responses or alternative responses to other spaces, whether it's mental health, whether it's human services, that are equally as fraught with issues. So you really have to think about what is it we're really trying to do here. So, it's probably a long way to answer your question. So it did impact me in a couple of different ways, only because I wear multiple hats. But I get it. And I think the concern I have is, in light of a lot of sort of legislative proposals that didn't pass this past November, I think a lot of folks believe it was a if or situation, and that's not what this is. And I think people really will be fooling themselves if they think because something didn't pass at the polls that this is a done deal, and it is not. And I think that is the reality that people are not really having conversations around, really equally trying to move things along because people are uncomfortable. Let's be real. People are uncomfortable. And the conversations that we have with chiefs across the country, I get you being uncomfortable, but there's a community now that is not really interested in your comfort level. And so that is something that you're going to have to really sort of wrap your mind around. And once you do that, then I think we can start having somewhat of an authentic conversation about what needs to happen.
Thank you, Tracy. Appreciate that. So I'm again, just a quick reminder: if you're in the audience watching, listening, right? Please mute your mic, right? So that we don't need to hear all your personal stuff that's going on, right? Appreciate your patience with us. So this next question, we'll start with Jeff and we'll go to Tracy and then go to Kevin. The Guardian research paper, Guardian article shows that that young Black men are 5 times more likely than young white men to be killed by police, right? And we know, right, in 2015 or so, the escalation, 1,000 plus people have died because of police encounter. And most likely, right, there are assertions applied to this, right? This application of force that leads to deadly force that leads to the death of mostly Black and brown bodies is the result of these ideas of reasonable officer, right? What would he or she or they do? Tactical, this is tactical responses. And there are many other permissive laws like this that allow for law enforcement to exercise, right, the kind of force they use. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to these ideas of reasonable officer, tactical response, and other permissive laws that allows and justifies the use of brutal forces that leads to the death of especially Black and brown bodies? Jeff?
Thanks, Raj. Tough question. I think the use of force, specifically the use of deadly force is, I honestly think it's been at the kind of the point of a lot of these discussions for a few years. Certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, a little bit more than before that. But looking at, law enforcement agencies in Minnesota across the country, I think are always trying to figure out how do you create systems, whether it be training or policy or a combination of the two, that put your officers in a position where they should hopefully never have to use deadly force or use, force as little as possible. But it's a very tough thing to try to come up with policies, procedures, and even legislation. In Minnesota, maybe some of you know that in 2020, the legislature did change the use of deadly force statute here in Minnesota, essentially trying to raise the standard for when deadly force could be used, so that it would hopefully have an impact where it was used less often. And in the 18 months or so since that legislation was passed, that has been found to have some, interpretation issues, I guess, and how that will be implemented across the state. in fact, has led to the border cities of in Wisconsin and North Dakota that have now said we will not send our officers across the border to assist in the state of Minnesota because of that statute and the way it was worded. And so, albeit it was well intended and intentions were good to look at that standard, I think law enforcement in Minnesota and across the country should be looking at how do you figure out ways to reduce the amount of force and specifically or especially deadly force. But it's a very complex question to try to answer. I think law enforcement is again, I kind of go back to how I responded to the first question. I think de-escalation tactics, community relationship or community engagement activities where departments spend a lot of time and energy trying to get to know the community. And we all know where there's a relationship, there's a much better chance of a positive result in a situation. But it's a challenging one. I mean, I think law enforcement is faced with situations from time to time that they don't feel like there is any other way to resolve the situation. And so we see those situations result in the use of deadly force. I'd like to see a scenario where there was never a use of deadly force. I'd like to see where there was hardly ever situations that led to officers feeling like they need to use force. But that is not the reality we're living in today. And I think looking for ways to reduce it, looking for ways to only allow use of force or deadly force when it is truly the only other option is the way we need to move forward. But it also needs to be a part of a larger strategy. I talked about it in the first question, where policing should be done in partnership with your community. And so what that means is you co-produce policing in partnership and in collaboration so that there are no surprises in how a law enforcement agency responds to a situation. And when you do policing in partnership with the community knows the standards because they help set the standards. And that doesn't have to be done legislatively. In fact, I think there's issues and problems trying to do it through fixing everything through legislation. It can be done at the community and the local level. And we could talk for a long time. And I know Tracy is well-versed in the co-production model of policing, but it really is essentially creating a policing model for your community that the police department and the community all agree to. How you use force should certainly be a part of the co-production of policing in your community. And when you do that, I think at the end of that process, the majority of the people in the community are far more comfortable with the way the community is policed because they had a seat at the table and helped craft it. The police department is a part of it, the community is a part of it. And at the end of it, developing policies and procedures that guide how that community is policed is truly done in partnership with the community. And Raj, I think that's how you get communities to be more comfortable with what are the standards for using deadly force, what are the situations where it's appropriate, and those that it is not appropriate because it's done in partnership with the community.
Just a quick question, right? Some analysts, some researchers, right, and community activists often say that the system itself is founded on racist ideology, and there's a through line between implicit and explicit biases that leads to the murder of Black women and trans communities and Black men's and Black and brown bodies, right? How do you weave that implicit, explicit bias into that response?
Oh, sorry, Raj. I was trying to read a question that just came in. Could you restate or give me that question again so I can give you a response?
Let's go to Tracy and then we'll come back to that question again.
Okay.
Go ahead, Tracy.
So I always love your questions. So let's back up a little bit.
Yeah.
So safety of any kind, right? Even if you co-produce safety, requires a power differential shift. And what we always have been talking about, and even when you talk about the reimagining pieces that you're hearing throughout the country, we're talking about a fundamental shift of power here. Who gets to determine what, who gets to say, what is legal, what is not legal. And that is, those are the things that sort of undergird that co-production piece. There has to be a realization that there's got to be some type of power shifting going on. I also want to lift up Dana's comment about women, Black and brown women, because this is often a conversation that is specifically about Black men, young men. And all too often, Black and brown women are also suffering at the hands of public safety. So if we think about what it is that we're trying to do here, and you talked about reasonable standard, and let's remember a reasonable standard was based on the reasonableness of a white man. So let's call that out first and understand it. Oftentimes, our own law enforcement folks don't get the history and understand what is happening there. And so that's one thing. So I think the reasonableness piece is it. The tactical portion of this, too many conversations have been around, de-escalation, trying to do something that is not going to escalate the situation. I think we always have to back ourselves up and ask the questions of why are we allowing officers to get into those situations to begin with? Because that is really the conversations that we're having, right? So, and that's where you see the alternative response pieces coming in, right? So what do you need an armed person for? And if you can, have that conversation and figure that out, I think a lot of people are still trying to have that conversation. And not only, what would you need an armed response for is what is the role of the folks who are armed responders? Because right now, law enforcement has no clue. Every day it's different. Every day something happens, they're told not to do something, which is good or bad, depending on where you live in your perspective. And so there is no real coherent sort of piece or understanding around what is there, one, a need for armed response, and two, what is the role and what does that look like? The other part of this too, we can't sort of ignore the narratives that get built around what happens in communities of color and interactions. We can't dismiss the fact that we also have conversations around fear and officers being able to articulate that they were in fear for their lives. And so we have to address the issue of fear, right? So what are you afraid of? Why? And maybe this is not the role for you. So there are a lot of other things that we need to be also sort of putting on the table with that. Jeff, you also mentioned, so policing is local. Let's be clear about that. I think most Minnesotans know that. Policing is local. There was not much hope pinned on the George Floyd Act at all. If you talked to anybody who's doing this work or is even in law enforcement would have told you that that was problematic from the beginning, and it was so divisive that there was no way that was going to happen. And in addition to, federal has very little jurisdiction over local. And so anything that's happening has got to be done on the ground, and it's got to be done by community. So I think that, when you talk about the threads of implicit bias going through, let's be clear. One of the most salient connections in implicit bias are Black folks in crime. Those are automatic associations that are done very quickly. We know this because of the science that we do, and we know this because this is something that shows up when we do this, no matter where we are in the country. And we know how those implicit biases come to be, that whether it's a narrative, whether it's your own family dinner table conversation. So we know that we're very much impacted by that. And so the ability to, one, acknowledge it, but I can tell you, Rajan, you know this as well, trying to solve for that is very difficult. For folks who do this work and saying, let's train folks in implicit bias, we know from the evaluation, it's not going to give you what, especially what the community is asking for. That's not it. At a minimum, you'll have an awareness around it. And we hope that awareness will also help you begin to slow down. So that's where I see that de-escalation piece. You need to start asking yourself questions. But we can't also discount the fact that 911 dispatchers are getting information, they're asking questions. So they are providing also another narrative to whatever is going on. So there's many, many component parts to this and many, many people involved in this conversation around, how are you guiding, ruling, what are you responding to and reacting to as well. So it is one of those things that's complicated, but it's not really. It's one of the, you can have this conversation, but you also have to be willing to have a really honest conversation about how we're training cops. How are we training them to react into certain spaces? what I would call, what I call ghost training, right? So we have a training curriculum in academies that are post-certified and that we're supposed to teach you for so many hours. But we also know that the instructors also tell you stories to make the work interesting, right? So, and those are stories that are one-offs that happened 30 or 40 years ago, if that, and it keeps the recruits engaged, and it keeps them in the mindset that this is the old ways in which we do this. We're law and order, we're gonna drive fast, we're gonna get bad guys, and we're gonna put them in jail. Kelly's smiling because that's the way we came on. I mean, that was it. That was the lure, right, of doing that. And so I think it's, if we're being realistic, I think we really have to talk about, not just these systems that are set up. And this is what a lot for me the last couple of years have been about. And the number one question is, can a system like this be repaired, fixed, or broken? And that's where, is it irrevocably broken? We need to do something different. And that to me is the fundamental question on the table. In addition to, what does it mean to be safe? And who gets to make that determination? So I hear you, Raj, in regards to, the standards, the narratives, and all those things. I think they all play a part in that. But I think where community certainly takes the lead in this is to have these discussions and really call those things out locally, council, legislators. I mean, it's to call it out and say, what do you mean by this? So it is that, and it's also with my own exhaustion that I say that folks will again try to make this be a moment, and that is it. And so, that is not it. That's where I'm at. So I didn't mean to be such a long-winded approach, but and I have to also recognize, because I wear two hats. Community, is definitely needing to be centered, but I also have to sort of remind people that you've got young officers, Black, white, women, male, those at the intersection, transgender, who are in a system believing that if they can, hopefully, that they could do something different. And when you have patrol officers on the street, and I have to remind people, patrol officers do not make policy. That is not their role. And so we have to really think about, when we see these things happen, where does the true accountability lie? So I'll stop there.
Tracy, thank you. And for those who are piping up questions on the chat, I appreciate your wisdom in your questions. So please hold those thoughts. We'll come to you. Kelly.
I just wanted to add that I think we have to have the larger conversation in our society that we think it is reasonable to be afraid of somebody simply because they're Black and at a very young age. And how we disassociate that. And so societally, we're taught at a very young age, Blackness, brownness is dangerous. And you see it reflected in 7-year-old Black and brown girls being handcuffed, where if you gave a police officer a scenario ahead of time that said, would you ever have to apply chemical agent to a 7-year-old girl? They would say absolutely not. And yet when we get in these situations and we get so far ahead of ourselves, our perception of dangerousness. And unfortunately, it's the case for many of us, and it goes unexamined. And because it goes unexamined, it's really easy for me to explain why it was reasonable that I was afraid of that 16 and 15-year-old girl, or that person who was reaching for their ID, but because they were Black, and other people will identify with that. And so until we're willing to have those deeper conversations, it is very difficult to decouple use of force. But if we have those conversations and you recognize that, it's a good step in the right direction of being able to look at just the instance and not the person. So that's what I had to add to that.
So Kelly, so thank you all. Again, please put the questions in the chat box. We'll get to it. Right, Kelly, as Governor appointed you as a post board chair, right? What are some of the things that are moving in the post board in terms of rule changes, right? Expectations for law enforcement, peace officers, as we call them, right? What are some of those things that you are excited about, and what are some of the things that you think we need to keep moving forward as opposed to is stalling?
So we have a lot of exciting things happening, and the Minnesota Post Board was created in 1979 to really address one problem, and that was recruitment and moving through agencies. It was never really intended to be a licensing board like most civilians think a licensing board operates, where if you go to a hairdresser and they mess up your perm, a licensing board can take that away. It's not the same in policing in Minnesota. And so we are doing, the first thing we did was we had an external audit because you need that outside eyes on your operation. And we realized we had a lot of internal issues and a lot of public facing issues. And so we're addressing those. But I think the most impactful is we are moving forward with a major overhaul of our rules. And that is everything from who can become licensed initially, the standards of conduct, and even perhaps how we address those standards of conduct. So it really is changing the entire focus of the board and what they do. And it's a big ship to turn. And Raj, as you know, you're involved in the rules overhaul process, but even little changes can have a huge impact. And for instance, right now, if you had received a citation for marijuana possession, you're not eligible. You were 18, you were in college, you got a citation for marijuana possession. You're not eligible to be a police officer in Minnesota. So we're going to change that. But if you're a police officer and you get arrested with a small amount of marijuana, you can continue to be a police officer. It doesn't necessarily affect you. So there's just weird things that we need to go in and we need to figure out. You know, there was probably a reason for them at the time, but we need to really look at that and then have the courage to change it. And it is going to be uncomfortable. And again, what I keep telling people is it's our turn to be a little uncomfortable. It's the turn for the police to be uncomfortable, because that's how we're going to make progress, is that we're not giving the service to all of our citizens. We're not providing that service in the way that they expect. And so we need to change our service delivery model in a way that everybody who pays for a service receives the service they expect.
Kelly, I'm going to just push you a little bit. So the Derek Chauvins of the world, right, have been doing what they do on a regular basis, and there was a deadly silence on the part of the Post Board, even after the murder of George Floyd. How do you address that as the chair of the Post Board? What are the things that led to that the Derek Chauvins of the world to take it for granted that I can put my knee on somebody for 9 minutes?
Yeah, so there's two issues there. The first is you're incorrect in that there was a silence, and it was the first time ever the Post Board released a statement. And I can all appreciate, thoughts and prayers and what that's worth. But it is a major cultural shift that you have the first time ever that the Post Board released a statement condemning the actions of one of our license holders, which was not easy and was not well received by the law enforcement community. But it's not about the law enforcement community. Our citizens needed to know that that was not how we're training our police officers. And so that's why that statement was put out. And then the second thing is, and I'm in no way co-signing for Derek Chauvin, but a bigger system allowed him to do that. So we're more than happy to throw the line level workers under the bus. We're more than willing to throw that individual officer and go, well, that's not the agency. Well, your agency promoted to a training officer, which is one of the most prestigious, one of the most important roles in a police department. If your agency ignores behavior, they're doing exactly what the agency tolerates. And that's not it. The individual needs to be held accountable, but what are you doing at an agency level? And so that is your agency. My agency isn't me, because I'm not here at 3 o'clock in the morning. The Mendota Heights Police Department is how our patrol officers treat that person that they pull over at 3 a.m. That's your agency. And so how do you bridge that gap? And then what role the state has in bridging that gap is the big question, and the one that we're wrestling with right now.
Appreciate it. Let me go to Tracy. Tracy, thoughts on post boards in general at the national level and at local levels?
Well, I mean, Kelly did an excellent job of explaining the problems with post boards, right? And so they are these antiquated bodies in some states that really do maintain the status quo, right? The same training curriculum, the same standards for trainers. Some of them don't even have the power to decertify, right? And so they are all very different in their very unique ways. They also typically don't have community members a part of the post board. They're usually retired officers or current, training officers. So there is, problems with just the mix of when you say the post board. It's interesting. I think this is one area where we all sort of talked about if something can happen or have a little bit more, authority and weight, it is through post. And that is not allowing officers to jump from state to state. If you are decertified in one state, you should not be able to show up in Colorado and get a job. And post boards don't really communicate in that way. And I think those are things that we really should be looking at and trying to figure out what are those sort of connecting threads that all our post boards should share. And it should be, maintaining who's been decertified, who also can't testify, right? So there's other pieces here. And Kelly mentioned, you promote someone knowing what their history is. So anyone who goes for a promotion exam in their own organizations, they know what the history is. And usually you ask the question, right? If I promote this person, what would other folks say, or what would the community say? And I would tell you, typically the community has no idea, because again, one of the other areas is the transparency of disciplinary records and what this particular officer has been sustained for or not, or accused of. And this, again, being another space where, we're saying we're training and we're doing things differently. And yet when we see an officer show up on TV, or whether they're in a press release, most of their counterparts will tell you that they saw it coming. But for some reason, the system inside that house couldn't hold that piece accountable. But most cops will tell you, yeah, well, we knew that was going to happen. They know it was going to happen. And then why doesn't leadership understand that that's going to happen and do something? In a sense, I think this is what the conversation was around Derek Chauvin. He had a history. You knew. Kelly is 100%. You make him a training officer? What do you think he's going to train? And what do you think he's going to be sort of passing on to new recruits? And so there is a lot of things that I think that we have to talk about. So it's not just the post board, but I think the post board should be given a lot more authority to do the things they need to do, to manage and to strip academies of their certifications of being able to do post-certification of training of officers. I mean, all of it. They should have that type of authority. But again, when you have, majority officer boards that want the status quo, you're not going to see that happen. So there is a lot of work to be done. And it's not just, Minnesota State Post Board, this is throughout the country. As you look in other spaces, some of them are post in name only. And they have zero authority to do it. So,
yeah, thank you, Tracy. Jeff, we have to go to the general question, but we got about 2 or 3 minutes for you to respond. Go ahead.
Okay, I can make it quick, Raj. Yeah, I guess I will say that I think that the Minnesota Post Board has, there's been, I think during 2020, 2021 legislative sessions in kind of the reform legislation, there's been some changes to increase citizen involvement. So Tracy, here in Minnesota, they added, I think, 2 positions on top of the 2 other citizen involvement positions. They also gave the post board directive to create additional model policies. But let's be honest here. The post board, and ultimately, I think it's a somewhat weak in terms of the authority that they have, but they're a regulatory board, and I'm not sure that we can rely solely on the post board to fix what's wrong with law enforcement. Now, they can certainly do some things to make it better and setting higher standards and in providing or mandating additional trainings. But here's where I think, giving agencies the ability to get rid of the bad officers, we'll use the Derek Chauvins of law enforcement, needs to happen outside of the post board. There's a question in there, a comment from Scott. We want to see arbitration reform in Minnesota at the Chiefs Association. Do you know if there's 100 police officers fired for misconduct, probably about 50 of them get their jobs back. That is the state's arbitration system as we know it today. We want to move that system out of what it is currently into an administrative law judge where they actually don't. There's a perverse incentive for arbitrators now to have about a 50-50 record, because if they're going to get picked and continue to get work, they have to have a record that's appealing to both the employee and the employer. That, in my opinion, I think our opinion at the Chiefs Association needs to change if we really do want to allow chief law enforcement officers to remove what they think are the bad officers. We need to kind of go about that in a different way. And we like the administrative law judge as an option instead of an arbitrator, because they're not going to be picked based on their record. They're going to be judging the case on the facts and the merits of the case. And so I think, post-board and the changes that are coming or going on there, to add more regulatory authority are probably somewhat overdue. As Kelly said, it was formed in 1979, but there's other things that we can do outside of the post board, I think, to help remove those bad officers from the departments that they work at.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I want to open it up and call on Dana Owens. Dana, you had an interesting question about Black women, Black bodies, right? You want to ask the panelists a question? Dana Owen. Is Dana still with us? Okay. What about Judy? Judy, you had said something about Tracy's comment. Go ahead.
Yeah. So let me just say that I am a retired Minnesota judge. And so I've been, I had a relationship to criminal law for a long time, recently retired. Tracy, you just made one sentence that I appreciated. I've been trying to be part of the conversation when we say, let's replace police officers with mental health workers or social service workers. I'm not trying to vilify anyone, but I am concerned about the racism and genocidal policies that built those systems, as well as the fact that I'm not defending our system, but we do have some due process and there's none in the mental health system, really. And people get locked up for extended periods of time. So I don't mean to be defending our system. I'd like you to say more about that, because I'm trying to start conversations there and have gotten no traction.
Thank you, Judge. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
So, it is something that is simple, but not that simple, right? So we have a community who's asking for a different way to respond, a more holistic way to respond that doesn't require an armed response. And we see this, mental health is the most obvious because that's the larger conversation that's been happening nationally. So when we have these conversations across the country, what we find when we convene communities around, services and what they need, they often will tell you that outside of the law enforcement piece, human services is probably the worst, the second worst, in the way in which they approach the problems and the way in which they sort of stereotype what is happening, and in some cases, not offering services at all. So there's a struggle also with the systems, other systems that also have the same issues. So whether you talk about implicit bias, where you talk about, the narratives around who deserves help and who doesn't, it is the same conversation with these sort of systems of service or system of help that are supposed to make sure people don't slip through the cracks, supposed to make sure that you have housing if you don't, food if you don't, medical care if you don't. And so it is, again, these conversations around systems that have inherently been disproportionately designed not to care for the other. And so how do you have this conversation at the same time? You're saying we don't want an armed response here. And what has also happened is, and I'll just tell you this because this has been my experience, other agencies have been far too silent around stepping up and who should be doing what. And I find that most, I'm sure they're all lovely people, but as long as one group is taking the hits, the other ones get very quiet. And if you remember, Judge, if you have a system that only works Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and your systems and your issues happen outside of those on the weekends, then you only have a group that's left to deal with them because they're the only group that happens to be working all day, every day, overnight, every weekend. So you really have to go back and look at what you're saying when we're providing a service. Are you truly, and who are you providing that service to? And are you designed to provide that support in the way in which that community needs it? And I would tell you at the moment, no, because even those, and this has been a while for me, but I can remember needing to call human services out and no one's showing up. And then us now trying to figure out how do we house and keep safe a family, folks, you know, that if the shelters are full, how do you do that? But the bigger question for me is, why isn't anyone coming out here? Because I'm not the person they needed to see. I'm not the one that can write that voucher, and I'm not the one that can give you what you need. And that is what the community is saying, is that we can't just default into another system. I think this is what you're saying also. We can't also default into another system that's not examining their own issues around how they deliver service to the most vulnerable people. And so that is the conversation. In many cities, it's happening now, right? So we say we don't want, you know, an armed response. The alternative isn't much better. And so then now what? Because that's really the question. So now what are we going to do? And now what are we going to, you know, what do we do? And, you know, as communities will say, you know, communities' needs don't end overnight. And they don't end because, you know, someone is not necessarily being able to support that. And I think that's where we're getting confused, that everybody's okay with one way of delivery of service. And that's not what's happening here, especially those who need it most. So I hope that was helpful. It is really time to have a conversation with those other agencies that are purporting that this is their primary role, right? That we are the ones that do the wraparound services. We are the ones that come, but yet when you talk to community, they will tell you that's not the service we're getting. So I think that is where you have to be, you know, if that conversation has to start already, that's where you need to begin to land. So, and yes, Alita was on point, fund what people need and find out what people need. That's the other part.
Thank you, Tracy. Linda, you want to ask your question. Kelly, I'm wondering if you could respond to Linda's question. She put it out there. Linda, if you don't want to come on, I can just say, Linda says that she doesn't buy this idea of the use of deadly force. Most of what we are here for today is because it has been obvious deadly force was not needed and was racially motivated. How do you, as post-board chair, chief, respond? And as a human being?
Yeah, I think that we need to look at every single one of those instances and ask those really hard questions. And you're right. It's the instances in which we all agree deadly force was necessary are not why we're here. So, you know, why we're here is the Philando Castiles of the world. And those are the things when I think, again, centering myself as a professional, the fact that I didn't speak out was a turning point in my career. The fact that I was too afraid to alienate myself from my peers to say that was wrong. We never trained you to act that way. That was my shame, but that energized me and encouraged me to start looking at things differently. And we still need to look at every single one of those. And technology does not fix process. Technology does not fix racism. But what I do think is that technology helps create a shared understanding. And when you see things, there's a reason that Rodney King we all know Rodney King is because it was on camera. But Black and brown folks in LA could have been telling you about Rodney King and everywhere for a really, really long time. And so, yeah, I think you're right. We have to look at those things. And then we also have to understand as a society, sometimes deadly force is justified. It's never right, but it's legally necessary to protect other people. And that's gross too. That's not a reality that we want, but we have to acknowledge that sometimes there's no culture in the world where we don't have armed people authorized to use deadly force on behalf of the government. So we just have to look at how is that force being used. And so no, I think those are all great points. And if you go outstate Minnesota into rural areas where it may not be a racial issue, you certainly have economic issues. And you certainly have those issues of power and voice. And we need to look at all of them.
Thank you, Kelly. Mary, Dr. Clifford, Professor Clifford, question?
So I was just speaking to some of the power pieces. I think Tracy covered it in her previous comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Jeff, I'm wondering, you know, Marion Cabo, who's an abolitionist, often say that that the system that took the life, that murdered Breonna Taylor and George Floyd does not have the answer that we are looking for, right? And yet we keep funding law enforcement. We keep saying law enforcement needs reform. And the MPD 150 report clearly says that that's a myth, right? Let's stop reforming law enforcement. Let's transform how we as a society function. How do you respond to that? You know, the idea that the system really doesn't, law enforcement as we know it, doesn't have the answer we're looking for.
Well, that's a deep question, Raj. So if the question is, do we need to just kind of throw away currently how we do policing and create something new that will be more effective? Well, on the one hand, I could say that would be great. What is that? And in the meantime, how are we going to deal with keeping people safe? What we're seeing in terms of crime increases, I think that is a very complex issue to solve. And so while I do think there's plenty of room for policing to get better and more modern, utilizing technology and utilizing a lot of the research that has been done by, you know, great institutions across this country to improve how we do it. I'm not aware of a different model that's going to work and that's going to have a reasonable kind of degree of success to switch to. I haven't seen that. I don't know what that looks like. And so I'm in a position where I think we need to continue to find ways to make it better. Law enforcement is facing some very complex challenges right now. Not only is it the issue of policing in urban areas and how race plays into it, an implicit bias in the challenges that are created where there's no trust or very low trust, but at the same time, there's significant increases in crime where people now are afraid for their kids to play in the front yard or jump on a trampoline, and they want more police to help keep them safe. So Raj, I don't have all the answers. I know that we need to continue to keep looking for ways to improve it, looking for ways to utilize, you know, it's 2021. And there are resources, there are other ways to do things that we know about today that we didn't know about 5, 10, or 15 years ago. And law enforcement, I think, has to be willing to come to the table and kind of put their, check their ego. And somebody mentioned in the chat earlier that we need a shift in power. And I agree, we need to figure out how can law enforcement get their entire profession wrapped around improvement. And what is a model that's going to work? And it may not be exactly the same from one community to the next. And honestly, I think that's okay. The issue of dealing with mental health calls is one that our association has worked on now for several months with a very large stakeholder group. We have 20 or 30 police chiefs and sheriffs. We have mental health professionals, all trying to figure out how can we improve the response of law enforcement to people in crisis or calls involving people who are mentally ill. And it's not an easy question to answer. The one thing that we've learned in the last 7 or 8 months here in Minnesota is that the mental health system it's not necessarily broken, it just doesn't exist. There's 32 crisis response teams in Minnesota. Now, that may sound like a lot, but they're very small. A particular crisis response unit in northern Minnesota may be responsible for 8 counties. Now think about the response time if you're responding to 8 counties and you're a team of 4. It just doesn't work very well for those crisis calls that law enforcement is going to. So in terms of the capacity of the mental health system to be an alternative to these calls for service, the resources don't currently exist. Number 2, the mental health community is telling us that they don't feel comfortable going to these calls alone while someone is in crisis. They want law enforcement there to help make the scene safe, get it to a point where the mental health professional can go do their work, and then they leave. But they are not comfortable going to all these calls by themselves. So I know in Denver, they have the CAHOOTS model where they have a co-responder system, and there's other embedded social worker models that exist. There's even telehealth models where if you don't have actual human resources that can respond to the scene, they can use iPads at the scene to help provide services that people are in need of. But we're finally breaking down these silos that have existed for decades between law enforcement and the health and human services folks. So we're kind of trying to figure out for the first time in collaboration with one another. And I'm confident that it's going to help make things better. And so go all the way back to the question, Raj, is it completely broken and needs to be torn down and replaced? I don't think that's the right approach, because I think it's going to take far too long to have a solution that everybody has confidence that's going to be better. We need to continue to look for ways to improve the current system, and law enforcement needs to be at the table and working with their communities to help do that.
Yeah. Hey, all of y'all, I'm going to ask for your patience because we'd love to hear a closing statement from Kelly, and then we go to Tracy and Jeff, like a quick closing statement about the discourse so far. Go ahead.
Just real quick, I think the answers are outside of law enforcement. When I was a waitress, I was never asked how to fix world hunger. When you're a practitioner of a system, you can't, there's experts in this, and we need to acknowledge that. And we need to deliver our individual services ethically while empowering those other services and systems to do the things we can. And that's why these conferences and hearing from everybody is empowering and exciting for me. So thank you all very much.
That's why we have Antonio Espinoza here, because he is a scholar about to fix this system. No, thanks, Antonio, for being here. Tracy, closing thought.
You said no, but yes, that's true, right? I think what we have to be careful of is just because we don't see it and know that it's possible, that we sort of stay away from what we should be trying to do. And we also are under the impression that these things can't happen simultaneously, because they can. And I think that is where you begin to really think about how do you deliver this type of public safety service differently. I agree with Jeff that it should be very tailored to the communities. Should not be one size fits all, and this is all you have, right? And so, Jeff, you mentioned in Denver, it's STARS, it's an offshoot of Cahoots, and that does not have police response. It is all local service providers who go. And we still have to deal with this issue of fear, right? I'm hearing it, and we do hear this from mental health workers. I'm afraid to go, and we need to really dig down and figure out why all of a sudden it's fearful to go into a place with someone who is out without meds. And I'm not talking about those who are, harm themselves or others. There are ways to approach that, but we still have to deal with these fundamental pieces, that we keep sort of rolling out in that narrative. Rises in violent crime, for those of us who do this work, we know these happen for a reason and that they're cyclical, and that we can't really show that type of causality, and we have to be very careful about the narratives we use. And as we look back at our crime stats, we know what's going on, and we know that this is happening while people are unhoused, unemployed during a pandemic, without access to their own mental health needs and all those things. And we really need to focus on how do we keep those things from happening, or how do we keep violent crime from being a spike and a part of a conversation. We know what to do. This has been going on for decades. Those of us who've been in policing for a while, we know what this does. And so we really need to focus on making sure that we're investing in the right place. I would say to your conversation, your question, Raj, around can police officers find the solution? I don't think that's going to happen in a way in which community wants it to happen. And I think that it's important that we have a really true understanding of the needs of the community, and we don't. We do not go in on a community level and to assess and ask, what do you need? How can we help? Let us get those systems and things that we have for now to work well, to reduce the harm. Because we don't have anything at the moment. What we should be focusing on is reducing harm and building something new. All of these things can happen at the same time. Most communities are not what I consider to be sort of a one-trick pony. They can do more than once. One thing at a time. What I get concerned is that this is re-traumatizing and very emotional for everybody involved. And you have to be able to provide some support around the traumatization of folks in these processes and in these places. And there's just full-out exhaustion. And the concern is, people get tired, they get burnt out, and they really have to remember to practice self-care. So for me, there is a way to do this, and I think it is folks on this screen, and it's going to be painful and it's going to be hard, and that's just the way that it is. And we're willing to do this for other areas, and yet we're not willing to take that for this. So that's all I have. And thank you for the invitation to be here for this discussion.
Jeff, thank you, Tracy.
Well, Raj, I know we're trying to end up here, so I'll keep it quick. I just want to say to the group, I think, stay involved and stay engaged. Law enforcement is, I think, at a point in time where I think there is more room for change and improvement now than, at least in my 31 plus years in this work. There are opportunities, and again, I go back to at the community level. If you're in a community and you're not happy with your police department, continue to ask questions and be involved and look for ways to make it better. Law enforcement's challenging within the law enforcement community, and we're seeing, startling numbers of people leaving law enforcement. And I'm not just talking about people that aren't good police officers. There's really good police officers that are in it for the right reason and do an excellent job in connecting to their community that are saying, I just don't want to do this anymore. They're frustrated. They're feeling a bit overwhelmed, I think, with everything that's going on, and they're leaving. And it's really hard to find people who want to do this work. And so I think the solution here is not an easy one, but we need to continue to working on improving it. At the same time, creating a dialogue where people aren't going to be afraid to get into law enforcement because the challenges are so steep that they can't be successful. Look, we may not all agree on how many police officers we need in a community, but we do need police officers to help keep communities safe. We need police officers to try to close that gap where there is no trust between police and community. They can't just all go away. And so there are solutions there. You got to stay involved and engaged in these discussions. I know law enforcement is certainly willing to do that, or at least I am. And I know many of the chiefs that I represent at the Chiefs Association are willing to do that. The road ahead is not going to be easy, and I'm sure there's going to be bumps along the way. But I think ultimately we're going to get to a place where we're all feeling better about policing and about the systems that are in play and how police officers do their work. But we're going to have to continue to do this hard work. We can't just have it be a cycle where it was intense for 18 or 20 months and then we kind of let off. We need to continue with these conversations like today and many others to improve what we're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thanks to everyone who attended this Minnesota Justice Research Center conference. I want to just leave you with the thoughts of Elder Alberta in 1991, right? A Native elder said that, you have shown me that you have a legal system, but we have come here looking for a just system. Let's work towards that. Love y'all. Thank you. Appreciate it.